Hello and welcome to Business on the Wire. Metro cities across India are drowning quite literally. Over the course of the last few weeks, Hyderabad and Bangalore have seen heavy rainfall that brought the city to its knees. When Telangana's capital recorded its highest 24-hour rainfall for October in more than a century, its nearly 100-year-old drainage system just couldn't cope. Maximum casualties were caused by overflowing drains, incidents of wall or building collapses, and of course, electrocution. With an increase in frequency of extreme weather events like high intensity rainfall, pluvial flooding or rain driven flooding as it's called has emerged as a critical issue in urban water management. It's a picture that's been seen in many other cities. You've seen it happen in Mumbai countless times. Gurgaon is flooded every time there is heavy rainfall. Up north, of course, Delhi is choking slowly but surely as the toxicity in the air is rising right up to hazardous levels. Why are our cities such a mess? And are these incidents precursors to how much worse things are going to get? Equally, are there solutions that we just aren't putting in place? Joining me to talk about that is Professor KT Ravindran. He was with the School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi, as head of urban design, and he's also a former Delhi Urban Art Commissioner. Thank you, Professor Ravindran, for joining in. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen several images of metro cities completely flooded and cars floating across lanes. It's disturbing, but it's not something we haven't seen over the last couple of years. And this concept of urban flooding, is this increasingly something that Indian cities should come to expect?
Yes, of course. When you say Indian cities, it varies in proportion from one to the other. But most of the areas which are connected with the coastal climate are in serious trouble. And sometimes internal locations like Hyderabad also. But it happens differently in different locations.
There is also the sort of observation or criticism, Professor, that this term urban flooding or pluvial flooding is a misnomer. It's not just to do with what's happening with weather conditions or with, as you said, how rivers flow, but it's largely a function of extremely poor urban infrastructure, poor drainage systems, rampant encroachment of lands. What would you say is more at play in the Indian context?
There's so many different things at play simultaneously. First thing is that the overarching thing is that it's climate change, and the frequency of rain and therefore flooding has increased. Frequency has really it has become very smaller and smaller it gets. That is, we are having more and more frequent floods. Yeah. And the intensity of and the quantum of water that comes in also has changed. So there seems to be massive changes happening in the two seas, which is bounding India, one on the Arabian Sea side, and the other the Bay of Bengal. In both of these, the depressions and the internal tsunamis and things like that are like increasing all the time, and they're occurring now with more and more frequency. So that means the cities along those areas have to be seriously revisiting their methods of planning. So basically, the one reason is that. The other is man-made reasons. I mean, climate change is something that it's now almost like we can only kind of do calming measures like using less energy and leaving, changing our fuel or managing water, etc. Those we can do to an extent, and they are just palliative measures. The real reasons are beyond our control because they are already let loose. For instance, the major glacial changes which are taking place, temperature variations taking place under the sea, which we have not seen, solar flares which are happening with a 12-year periodicity. So those things actually impact the way the climate behaves on land, and we seem to be in for a serious, serious trouble in terms of climate change from that perspective. The other is the man-made issues. For instance, our deforestation. Yeah. not connected necessarily immediately with the cities, but water is not something that's found by a city or municipal boundaries or state boundaries or any such thing. It's a system, it's a natural systemic issue. So when you damage one location, the impact can be in completely different location. So we have all this deforestation, pollutions going into the rivers, their capacity to carry water reducing progressively, and coupled with the climate change issues, it's become very aggravated on the one hand. Now, if you look at settlements themselves, there are other man-made reasons, like I would say primary reason is extremely poor planning. That's the primary reason. Because we have allowed, in the absence of a national urbanization policy, we have allowed our cities to grow inordinately large in an uncontrolled way. And as the economy has been booming in the last decade or so, more and more investments are coming into the city, and that's turning into more and more expansion of the cities. And this unbridled expansion uh, leads to kind of invasion of natural areas like lakes and water catchments and so on, which also decreases their capacity.
Yeah. I want
Right from the sub-regional level to the local level of the master plan, there are wrong moves which have been made over a period of time.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's an excellent
So,
point, sir. And I just wanted to use, Hyderabad as a case study to understand this better, where, as you said, there are flaws in urban design, there are drainage issues, there are land encroachment issues. And as I understand it, in 2000, there were actually recommendations given after the floods to seriously rework how Hyderabad was functioning and expanding. What went wrong?
well, man-made issues, of course, are the primary reasons for a place like Hyderabad.
Yeah.
For the severity of the impact, it's always the man-made reason. Climate change is something that you have no control of. I mean, we don't have complete control. We can have control it to a small extent. But the other man-made issues like indefinite expansion, completely ignoring the topography of cities. They are building low-lying areas like crazy. Hyderabad, for instance, has increased in its size within the last 100 years. It's increased the size of the city by 12 times. Yeah. And Hyderabad has got 3,000 odd major lakes,
Yeah.
which actually were functioning like a sponge in the city, absorbing the water into the ground and then making that available through tube wells, etc., for people to use. Now, that system has been overridden because of increased supply of piped water. People are not relying anymore on groundwater. And the idea of drought is kind of, we've been doing a beautician's job on the water management issue, always making sure that it is available 24 hours and so on and so forth. So people don't realize the permanent damage that is being done to the sources. So Hyderabad, all these 3,000 odd lakes that Hyderabad has, is been all their catchment areas have been invaded. Their uh, their uh, their water levels have shrunk considerably. Many of them have vanished. Many of them have been completely built over. And the expansion that's been happening towards the south and southwest of Hyderabad has actually been happening in areas which were acting as the sponge of the city. City itself was actually planned on top of 7 hills, and there are one or two, purely, kind of center city kind of lakes, the Himayat Sagar and the Hussain Sagar, which are man-made lakes. And they were regulating the water into the Musi River, and the Musi River's left bank is lower than the right bank. So it has been flooding on the left bank considerably, and that's where a lot of the poorer people of the city were living. So the impact of this has been what we have seen just last week on the television of cars floating in the streets. And finally, who makes the money and who pays for it? The money is being made by the real estate lobby, and the payment is being made by the middle class and the lower middle class and the very poor of the city. They use the ground so much more than the wealthier class. So when there is a flood of, say, 3 meters, their entire house is gone underwater. It will only flood the stilted parking area of the rich, but it will flood the entire belongings, house, possessions, entire thing, livelihood, everything is wiped out in one rain. That's the price, that's the heavy price they pay, and someone else is benefiting it. So there obviously is a kind of collusion that you can find between different types of economic forces and political forces, which actually lead to this kind of development. And Hyderabad has had an insane kind of growth, priding itself as the electronic city and so on, but always building in areas which are the catchments of lakes. And now the price is being paid. This year it became more severe. Year on, it could even become more severe.
Yeah.
So Hyderabad is a very specific case to show this.
But
also, the interesting thing is,
please
sorry.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was saying that the interesting thing is that Hyderabad doesn't have a sea coast, but the storm surge has been so high that all the entire Andhra coast took the brunt first. Then that whole thing moved on to Hyderabad and to Telangana, and parts of Telangana and Hyderabad city in particular suffered most from it. And even though it is not a typical coastal city, which is actually subject to storm surges like a lot of Andhra is, Telangana has suffered quite a bit this time. So we have to study the larger patterns of movement of rain and take precautionary measures.
Right. It's also not something we haven't seen in other cities, Professor Ravindran. For example, even one brief but heavy spell in Gurgaon causes a complete, a route across the highway. And again, you see the cars floating, people stranded there for hours. I was reading a report, in 2018 by the Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disasters. And they pointed out that even these smart cities which are being planned have very little by way of bolstering for climate adaptability. In fact, their study showed that more than 55% of India's so-called smart cities are prone to floods. My question and concern here is that, is this going to be something we just have to live with, and is it actually going to start, happening in pretty much every city?
See, I think the long-term impact of these will be that it'll become economically unviable to invest in these larger cities for any kind of long-term investment. So the result would be that the investment will start moving to smaller and smaller towns, because big cities are going to be unlivable in a very short time. On the one hand, you have the storm surges which are happening from the sea. Then you have flooding that's happening from the rivers. You have flooding that happens from all the damming that we are doing to conserve water for drinking water supply. So there are multiple sources from where these floods are now beginning to invade the cities. The obvious impact would be a complete economic downturn. So this economic downturn will either depopulate the city, the big cities, and will move to smaller locations where environmental guards are much less, political vulnerability is much more, decisions are not necessarily made in those locations, decisions are made in central planning organizations in the big city or in the capital, and it moves on to the small cities. Sometimes they don't even visit those cities. before they prepare a plan. So they have no idea as to how the landform is, where the road should go, where it should not go. And Hyderabad, for instance, is a very good example of that. If you look at the airport development in Hyderabad, which is in its southwest of the earlier city, the new airport, it's a very nicely built airport, well maintained, it's very impressive. But if you look at the roads, all the road networks which lead to the city and the big highways that's been constructed across it for accessibility and so on, are all 3 to 5 meters above the land. Yeah? It's running right across the slopes of the land, all the roads. So the unthinking infrastructure development has two impacts. One is that the water flow is completely stopped. Surface water flow is stopped, so it leads to flooding. Second thing is that you cannot even access that land from the road. To access that land, you have to go down 5 meters. So the real estate value of those things are also very low. At the same time, it's also destroyed the environment. So a lot of the lakes which are in the south of the main Hyderabad city are all suffering because of this kind of development. Hyderabad also has a ring road. A ring is any kind of a ring road is a disaster for water management because it goes all around the city irrespective of the slope. Yeah, to an extent you can you can save the road by raising it, but then the water flow is stopped. And it is impossible to plan at that level of a city enough, culverts and outlets and so on to be able to take the water flow out. So there are fundamental mistakes in planning, which are working contrary to the land flow, water flow, and the landform. This is the basic mistake that you find in every city in India. The first thing you give a mouse to a town planner is that he draws a circle around the city. And that's the ring road. Perfect solution for diverting traffic and, remove, and also value adding the land which is along the ring roads. So the real estate lobby is very interested in those roads. So the land values really soars up. So there is this whole, I don't know whether to call it ignorance or they're just helpless or powerless or whatever. The planning bodies are pretty powerless. The decision is always political.
Oftentimes when these kind of incidents occur, Professor, there's always talk of how we need to rethink policy and reimagine policy. But when I was going through what exists, we actually have a number of policies already in place. There's the National Mission on Sustainable Habitat that suggests precisely what you did about a certain percentage being left for water bodies. There are guidelines in terms of how much ground coverage is allowed. Equally, the Ministry of Jal Shakti now has a flood management program, I understand, which is to help cities. What's going on? What's going on with all these policies?
It's one thing to have all these rules and regulations, and it's something else to implement it. So there's a major gap between policy and its implementation. And the main instrument of that implementation is, to begin with, is the planning body. Those who prepare the physical plan of the city, they don't study the landform. You go to any planning office, you will see that there are hardworking people, there are good thinking people, but all their thought is narrowed down to land management for more and more profitability. It's not about water management. It's high time that we had a complete, maybe a ministry for water management at every state, because many of these things are state subjects, they're not central subjects. Central government can pass any number of rules and regulations, they can write wonderful reports down, make recommendations, but their ability to deal with urban planning is very low because it is a state subject. It's not even in the concurrent list. Of course, water management at rivers, etc., are in the concurrent list. But urban planning is completely in the state list. So final implementation has to happen at state level. And as we go down the hierarchy of planning in our country, from central government to the local bodies, the capacity of uh, the staff to think, ideate, and interact with ground situations reduces considerably. You have brilliant economists sitting on the top in the center, but there's no one who can even add up or fill a form at the local level. That's the kind of imbalance that we have. So we need to strengthen the local bodies upwards. That's the only way the implementation of all these wonderful policies that you just described, implementation is only possible if they have the capacity to deliver. That's what is happening with the smart cities also. They don't know how to deliver.
There are any number of examples, Professor, globally of how cities struggled with this kind of, urban flooding phenomenon, and how they created, as you pointed to earlier, sponge cities, whether it is in the Netherlands or, even closer to in China, that also experienced this. Can cities fix this themselves? Are they able to fix this themselves? And are there still 3 or 4 or 5 things that can be done quite immediately to address the issue?
See, as I said, I think the weak link in our country is always between our intent and our implementation. As you have rightly pointed out, we have all these laws, wonderful laws about climate change and about managing floods, etc., etc. We have all that on paper. But when it goes down, if you take, for instance, the example of Netherlands is below the sea level. The entire country is it's built below the sea level by pumping out the water and so on for years and years and years. It's an expensive process, and perhaps we can't afford that. And the only city which has a parallel to that is Calcutta. Because Calcutta is below the Hooghly River line. So it's actually a low-lying land which slopes towards the sea, towards the east. And we have continuously built roads and railway lines across that slope. The last example is the Eastern Metropolitan Bypass in Calcutta, which is built completely against, it was a swampy land. Our urban planners still don't recognize swamp as an asset. Swampy lands are big assets for cities, but they are seen as possible places through which you can take a road and then fill up and develop. So what you do is you transfer the problem to the next land parcel. You save one place, build it up, and then you move the problem to another location. Then you build one more ring road, then you build up that space. So this is absolutely suicidal as a policy. Our cities will become not economic growth, engines of economic growth, but they will become cities which have no vitality in them. Because how long will people keep investing in a place where there's such a heavy loss of work hours, such a heavy loss of financial losses, such a heavy loss in terms of health expenses? It's post-flood problems that come in health, which affects the mass of people in our country most, because their vulnerability is much more, their access to medicine is much less, and also their economic resilience is very low to recover from this. So you are actually compounding the problems for our people when we do this kind of moves. So when we look at the example of other countries, we don't have those problems. They are small countries. Netherlands is, I don't know, it's less than 10 million, 8 million or something. The population is like half of Delhi. So they are really small countries. And they're actually like managing a neighborhood as far as India is concerned. If you look at the problems that are there in Eastern Metropolitan Bypass and between the railway line and the Eastern Metropolitan Bypass in Calcutta, that whole parcel of land where you have Rajarghat also come up on the upper level.
Yeah.
They were all swampy areas. They were ideal areas where a swamp-like development could have happened and turned that into an asset to the city. But that's not what we have done. I'm just giving an example. When you said comparison of Netherlands, that's how they manage. And if you look at their rivers, they are of a very different nature from our rivers. You know? They are not as huge as scale in our rivers. And they have also been, wherever they have contained, try to contain it by embankment and so on. I don't know whether you remember in 2011, there was a major flood in Europe.
Yeah.
They actually inundated, it looked like what we saw about Hyderabad last week on the sun. That's what was happening in Europe in 1911. But they have quickly entered into some measures and looked at it from long term and mitigated it to an extent. But that danger still lurks. So the lesson that we need to learn is that you cannot work against water. You have to work with water. You have to take the problem of water along with us in our development rather than try to block it, to stop it, and to work against it. But that lesson has to become implementable at local level. It's a big task, but that's is the only solution I find.
Which brings me back to, the second part of the question I asked you, Professor, which is that, is there anything that we can still do on an immediate basis to address this? Because there's been talk about revisiting stormwater drains, figuring out the water carrying nullahs. Are we keeping them clear enough? Is that enough, or do you think that as well will be very, very, very cosmetic measures?
That is actually, you have to look at the problem from two perspectives. You have to look at it from the short term and also from the long term. Or there can be also many other terms or medium levels of interventions in the middle. But the immediate measure is to make sure that those who are impacted, it's like, I don't know how many thousands of families are impacted in Hyderabad. And the poorer families are more impacted because they lie in locations which are very vulnerable to storm surges. Their buildings are made of kacha materials, which are far more vulnerable to water deterioration. All their livelihood is at the ground level. The road is the public space. The road is their livelihood location site. And the home itself is a place of production. So all those are now deteriorated. And there is the subsequent illness that follows. So when you say short-term measures, in my view, short-term measures should be to look after the people. The shortest term measure is immediate attention is towards health and management of rehabilitation. Then we can move to the idea of looking at clearing of the nullahs. Of course, perhaps all these can also happen parallelly. We have enough workforce. We have enough people who are jobless. Just like we have the Narega in the rural areas, why can't we have these urban projects, which are actually livelihood mission projects for all these people? Why is it that we are not even thinking about the city as a potential place for this kind of semi-skilled employment, which it is? We are not recognizing that employment. So why not we use these people to mitigate all these mitigative measures of clearing and cleaning and raising bunds and clearing the lake areas, etc., etc. Even desilting. We need huge manpower of semi-skilled manpower, some machinery and some supervisory capacity building and a lot of manual manpower. So why can't we use this as an opportunity to convert? That is also a short-term measure that can be done, because that will also bring money into the people whose capacity to medicate themselves, to look after the children, to make sure to refurbish their houses, that will all go up and they start earning a living.
Yeah.
So that is the short-term measures should be at people. And the midterm measure should be at desilting and cleaning up of nullahs and so on. And the long-term measures have to be actually looking at the overdevelopment that has happened, the encroachments that has happened along water bodies, how all those lands which have been earlier catchment areas of the lakes have been now occupied by legal and illegal construction. Revisiting that is the long-term solution. We don't have another solution. If people have to be safe, we have to work with water.
Ironically, around the time that the Hyderabad floods happened, Professor, there was a report out by the UN, their disaster risk reduction report, which pointed to the fact that India is the second worst flood affected nation in Asia. This is obviously data that is available to pretty much every state government and the center and city level. What is the economic cost involved in addressing the issues on a long term basis, like you pointed out? Because it's important for a city like Delhi to address this, because there are ramifications equally for Bangalore or Hyderabad. Is the economic cost very large? Is it something that is being considered? I don't know enough about how the money has been spent around this.
So as soon as there is a flood, there's a request that goes from every chief minister to the center saying, give us 2,000 crores. Yeah. Give us, I don't know, 3,000 crores, 5,000 crores, depending on the scale of the damage. So that is not the cost as such. The actual cost we pay are in many spheres. Only one level is the economic cost. There's a massive social cost.
Yes.
There's a massive health cost. There's a massive cost on the economy. Say all the insurance companies are in serious trouble. All those areas all those equipments which have been insured, all those basements which have been housing pumping stations and, boilers and all that is underwater. So there are serious ramifications for the entire economy. There is long-term impact that happens on business because the recovery time is slow in most cases. Of course, medicines will sell better, antifungal creams will sell better. There are small things which are unseen things which actually will multiply. When there is more bacteria, there's more medicine required.
Yeah.
And after a post-flood condition, we have massive upsurge of bacteria. So there are all these kind of costs which are implicit in them. They're not factored in for. All what is factored in for is those immediate measures that they're talking about is, reconstructing the roads, rebuilding so that vehicular movement becomes easy once again. That is their first objective, unfortunately. Of course, the vehicular movement is also the backbone of the economy. It's a catch-22 situation. What do? Do you promote them or you don't promote them? You have to promote them. There is no option, because if there's no economic activity, there's no city.
Yeah.
So if you start costing it, it will be different kind of cost in different kind of locations. And on all these different layers of damage, the economic cost will also vary from one to the other to the other. If you look at the reason why cities flood in India, they're all different reasons. Bombay floods for one reason, Hyderabad floods for another reason, Bangalore floods for a similar reason to Hyderabad, but in a different way. Bangalore is built on all its ponding systems. If you look at the geography of Bangalore, Bangalore is at a high point and in the center of the southern peninsula. It's in the absolute dot center. It's 450 kilometers on all sides to the coast, to coasts and so on. It was planned that way by the British to move their troops. And it is on a hillock. And it's not a river-fed city. It's a city where water supply has to come from far. And they had this major ponding system, network of ponding in Bangalore and its vicinity, and they've all been built upon. I remember over a decade ago, I was a member of the Environmental Impact Assessment Committee at the center. And out of 20 projects we consider in one sitting, at least 12, 13 will be from Bangalore. And all of them on lakes and dry lakes, uncultivable land, what they call uncultivable. They keep it away from cultivation. They pay the farmers to not to cultivate and then turn that into real estate. And those are the projects which were built at that time in huge scale, 10 years ago when there was so much upsurge of the economy. And now there is no water in Bangalore to drink, and every road is flooding. On top of it, you also have this kind of infrastructure, invasion of infrastructure in Bangalore. Almost simultaneously, so many infrastructure projects are going on in Bangalore, which has prevented water flow from one place to the other, apart from low-level areas being developed. The entire southern Bangalore development are lying in low-lying areas. So now the problem is very different there. In Chennai, it's a very different problem. If you look at the last major flood that happened in Chennai, the problem actually occurred in the hinterlands of Chennai. If you look at the geography of it, from the Eastern Ghats all the way down to the city, the land slopes down to the city, and there are 3-4 outlets in the city which actually take the water down to the Arabian Sea, to the Bay of Bengal. Yeah? And all those areas have been built up. They've had indiscriminate industrial development in the catchment areas of those things. There was a 1,000-year-old ponding system around Chennai, which was the backbone of the rice cultivation. So there were many number of large and big and small ponds, which are all interconnected, and they finally flow into the rivers, and they find their way to the sea. So that entire area has been industrialized. There are factory sites which are like 500 acres land, 500 hectares land. And most of it is concretized because they're making automobiles. And there are engineering colleges, campuses, research centers, various other factories. There's a whole spin-off of industrial growth in the main catchment area of the space above Chennai. And all that water comes right into the city, and the runoff there is increased. Silting has increased horribly. So the capacity of the ponds to hold water is reduced. Many of them have been closed. And finally, when they come into the estuary, into the river bank itself has been developed. Look at the Madras airport is sitting on the Adayar river bank. That's why we had water up to the middle of its windows, middle of the windows of the airplane. I mean, there was that much water standing in the Madras airport because it is sitting on the floodplain of the river. If you go a little more downstream in that same river, you will find that the PWD has developed humongous number of low-income and middle-income housing along the water, on the river banks, in the floodplain. Yeah. All those houses had 2 floors of water in them. So if you look at Chennai, one is that regional development, which has gone wrong because, we're 30, 40 kilometers up northwest of Chennai, you had all these industrial developments increasing the runoff. And when there's a big rain, the water flows all the way from Kanchipuram from on one side to the Eastern Ghats on one side. All that water flows into Chennai. And the mouths have been all built up. So you have the compounded problem of a regional planning that has gone wrong, and a master planning which has been completely ignoring this issue. Yeah. Many swampy areas in the south of Chennai have been developed into swanky housing projects. And all those projects had one full flow level of water in them when it happened last time. And now you look at what has been done. They have done some mitigation measures. They've set up a resilience agency. They've got a climate change dealing with institutions to deal with them and so on. A lot of that has happened. But they have not looked at the regional problem.
Let me ask you. Yeah. Let me ask you a final question then, Professor. You know, much of what you lined out is something that grabs the headlines for 3 days and then is a forgotten story. Chennai is flooded or Chennai has no water. Hyderabad is flooded. Delhi has its own water issues. We carry on. You know, we come to our knees and then we get up and we get going. Do you fear, and I don't want to put the doomsdayer's cap on you, but do you fear there will, come a point when a city will not be able to get back from its knees after having suffered, this kind of an event?
I think it will come. Unfortunately or fortunately, it is going to come because there is a limit to resilience that you can build into any city. On the one hand, the source of problem is getting more and more aggravated. Yeah? On the other hand, we are doing precious little about mitigating it.
Yeah.
So where is our source of resilience? We just don't have that resilience. And it's going to be, resilience is like, like a chemical allergy, Your body doesn't become immune to it. You become increasingly more and more vulnerable as you get more and more of those attacks. Yeah? So the vulnerability of the city is actually going up. And climate change is not helping, nor is our planning helping. Then what do you say? Bhagavan Bharosa, what do you say? So there is, I don't see a bright future for our cities if this situation as it is at present continues. And we know that the huge part of our GDP actually comes from the production that happens in cities.
Yeah.
And I think we are going to take an economic hit if our cities are going to be underwater. And that's actually a very important thing to think about. The solution perhaps is, in the long term, is also to have an urbanization policy, a national level urbanization policy, to which all states are part and are consulted, which can then allow this kind of unbridled growth that's happening around cities to be distributed more evenly, more balancedly through the regions. Andhra Pradesh has just recently done a regional balance plan, under which even the idea of the capital was shifted to 3 different locations. Yeah? And that was an attempt, that's perhaps the first state which has attempted something like that, is to actually distribute population and wealth more evenly across the land so that we don't have this kind of concentrated disasters.
Yeah.
Highly vulnerable economies in the path of this kind of calamities. So the entire resilience of the entire state is taken into consideration together rather than trying to mitigate the problem in one place. But that's just one state doing it.
Yeah.
Kerala, of course, has many plans in that form, because Kerala also is blessed with almost that kind of a model already by nature of its landform and so on. It's got a linear growth where there's better distribution. But Kerala has been ignoring the fact that the Western Ghats are going to get more and more rains, and the capacity of all the dams which have been built are going to be breached very soon. They're at the brink even now. In the last floods, it was proven very well. And just like in Chennai, very similar problem. They had the Cochin airport sitting on the riverbed. That's why there was so much water gushing through the airport, because it is on the riverbed. So long-term problems have to be addressed by relocating these. It's not easy to relocate an airport. It's humongous expenditure, humongous infrastructure. And the damage it causes in its sub-region is also huge. And those prices have already been paid by the city. And now to shift it is going to be a tall order. But we have to call a spade a spade. We don't have an option. What do? Do you allow your people to die in the floods? Allow their properties to be inundated? Or do you move them? It's a very serious reconstruction issue. And I think at a national level, This needs to be addressed not just as a central law or central recommendation, which goes, should be a consultative process through which maybe the Interstate Council, some organization like that can spearhead that.
Yeah.
And make sure that this flood mitigation is planned for at a national level to begin with, so that we can have more balanced regional growth. What we have now is, if money is being made in Bombay, all capital will flow to Bombay, because it's easy to recover from a place which already is wealthy. And we are just allowing that to happen more and more. That's what has happened in Delhi, for instance. The per capita income in Delhi is so much more than the rest of the nation. You know? And the price we are paying by development, by pollution, by the number of cars on the street, something 11, 12 million cars, automobiles, no, sorry, not cars, they include motorcycles and so on, but fossil fuel consuming vehicles. There are more than between 11 and 12 million such things in the city, in Delhi alone. That's almost 50% of the people who own a motorized vehicle. It's unthinkable in the rest of India.
Absolutely.
That's unthinkable in most cities in the world.
Absolutely. We are completely out of time, unfortunately, but thank you for this rather disturbing but extremely fascinating conversation, Professor. I hope that people are listening.
Sorry, I hope I didn't sound too pessimistic.
No, you sounded realistic, and I think people should, sit up and take note, because if we don't now, then there are higher prices to pay for us and our children as well. Thank you very much for your time today. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.